Hi, I'm Kendra Corman. If you're a coach, consultant, or marketer, you know marketing is far from a perfect science. And that's why this show is called Imperfect Marketing. Join me and my guests as we explore how to grow your business with marketing tips and, of course, lessons learned along the way. Hello and welcome back to another episode of Imperfect Marketing. I'm your host, Kendra Corman, and today I am joined by Eric Smith, and we are going to be talking about podcasting, but a little bit different than we normally do. Today, we're going to be talking about getting exposure, leveraging audiences through podcast advertising. Welcome, Eric. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Thanks, Kendra. Excited to be here.
Talk to me about how did you get into podcast advertising?
Yeah, kind of by accident. I mean, I've always been a big podcast listener, just from a consumer standpoint. But so I've been at my current company, Incremental Media, for the past 5.5 years. But before that, I spent another 5 years at a company called Vox Media, which is a big digital publisher. So they have brands like Vox, Vox.com, Eater, Curbed, SB Nation. They merged with New York Magazine when I was there. So a big digital publisher. And they had a really rapidly growing podcast business. So I sort of, learned the foundation of the podcast world when I was there on more of the publisher side. And now here at Incremental Media, we're a marketing partner who helps brands diversify their media mix into channels like podcast advertising. So now I'm more on kind of the buying side as opposed to the selling side. So I've kind of seen both areas of my unique podcast world.
Very cool. Very interesting. So why do you guys recommend and represent brands and buy space on podcasts?
Like I said, I joined 5.5 years ago now. I moved into the president and COO role in January, and I had came basically to build out our podcast division. The company had historically been in more kind of traditional offline channels. So package inserts is what the company was most well known for. So like when you get a package and there's printed offers from other brands inside, we're actually the largest buyer of inserts in the country. So we're huge in that space. But, we had sort of decided to kind of want to evolve the company a little bit. And podcasts have a lot of surprising similarities to some of those more traditional channels. So even in just the way that they do attribution, so meaning like using a promo code is a very basic example to sort of evaluate the individual podcasts. And then how we sort of, buy the advertising is on like a podcast by podcast basis, kind of like an insert program by insert program basis. So there's a lot of unique similarities. So the founder and CEO of the company was just sort of deciding to kind of diversify their offering. And we had, built a relationship and decided that it made sense for me to sort of kind of build the podcast division from the ground up. And, technically speaking, we have 6 channels we specialize in, but podcasts is now our second biggest. And some of the other channels have like a 15-year head start. So podcasts have grown really big, really fast, which is exciting and just, challenging for me to kind of figure out all the, fun and challenges that come along with that.
Well, and I never thought of the similarity between the inserts and podcast advertising, but I can definitely see it because it's very niche, right? You're targeting into a specific audience that follows a certain show or falls into a category that would be interested in that show, right? Whereas like certain things like subscription boxes, like I get those inserts all the time I like FabFitFun is my big example. I always get a ton of those little inserts in there. I never thought of it that way, but I think that, it's a lot of efficiency that you can purchase because you're targeting such a specific audience and it's an audience that's already following.
We do like to, as a company, kind of be a big fish in a smaller pond, right? So there's, hundreds, if not thousands of companies that can help you with digital advertising, but there's only really a handful that know podcasts or no inserts in the way that we do. So, even just from a business standpoint, we felt like it's a place where we could get big quickly and really make a name for ourselves. So yeah, it kind of fits into our little incremental media world as well.
I work with a lot of small to medium-sized businesses, and we're always trying to figure out, okay, how can we get effective and efficient marketing? And there's only so much that social media will bring in, right? You got to go beyond that to get your name out there. And I know that there was a bunch of research that was done a lot. It feels like I should say a long time ago. I actually don't even remember how long ago it was anymore, but it wasn't yesterday. So I'm going to go with a long time ago that said audio is more well retained by, I think, the listener than almost any other medium. And they have a tendency to have better recall on the ads in podcasts and on Spotify and things like that. Have you guys been finding that? Or how are you measuring success? Is it just the the tracking
No, yeah,
codes?
so it's a good question. So, well, first, we specialize mainly in what we call the host endorsed style, right? So we're sending physical products most of the time to hosts, and then having them talk about that experience in the ad read. So, a good example is like we work with Naked Wines, and they send wine to hosts, and then hosts say, hey, I had a glass of whatever for my Naked Wines, box recently. So, if you have a physical product, I think that's kind of the best way to utilize the full value of podcasts. Not to say if you don't, you can't also have success there, but that's really what it's best for, I would say, is that kind of like e-commerce, sometimes subscription brands do really well too. But from an attribution standpoint, not to get too technical, but basically we partner with a company called Podscribe that essentially brings the same elements of digital advertising to podcasts. So, they can have a pixel within the podcast that fires and then a pixel on your site. So they can say, hey, I know person listens to this podcast, came through and converted. It matches on IP address. So it's very similar to connected TV advertising, if anyone's ever tried that before. But it's really the most kind of sophisticated way to say, okay, maybe 100 people use my promo code, but Podscribe picks up 300 people. And it's like, hey, not everyone's using the promo code for a million different reasons. They might have gotten hit with your, Facebook ad or Instagram ad afterwards and got a better offer there or, whatever it may be. So, yeah, long-winded way of saying like Podscribe is a really, really helpful tool to sort of bring the elements of digital advertising that people are used to into our more kind of, traditional audio offline world.
I love that. And I've always been a fan of host reads or the host perspective because they don't fast forward that section, right? I mean, when they start playing the ad, right, a pre-recorded ad or something like that, a lot of times people are skipping on their phones or their device, and you don't do that when the host is speaking. And so that natural in read is so much better. I mean, way back in the day when radio was popular, we did that.
We talk about it a lot in terms of like people have like a relationship with their hosts, right? Like I've, listened to Bill Simmons for probably a decade at this point. Like I feel like I know him, do I really? I don't know, but I feel like I do. So same type of thing with probably you and your listeners, right? They feel like they've gotten to know you. And, sometimes people say they think of podcast host as like a friend. So you're trying to sort of capture onto like, hey, you trust me. I like wine. Check out Naked Wines. They make a really cool, interesting product. So you're sort of trying to, just like influencer advertising or anything else, but you got to sort of, if you're a marketer out there listening, like try and find the sort of niche that makes sense for you. Like I have a friend who makes religious jewelry and he's found like religious podcasts that, hosts that are sort of speaking about prayer or something like personal to them. So anyways, you got to kind of sort of find your category, your niche that makes the most sense.
Well, and again, I mean, there's just so many niches in podcasting that you can find the audience, and not all of them are huge. There's a lot of smaller sized audiences. That's good because that means you're not getting the extra noise from other places. And I think that that's so important. And yeah, I mean, that's why I do podcasting, is to help accelerate the know, like, and trust factor, right? They hear me, watch me, listen to me every week, right? Consistently, I'm here. I, I would like to think that we're building a relationship. Okay. For those of you listening and watching, I know you. I love you. We're good. We're friends. Okay. So, what makes this so effective? Right? Is it just the niche? Is it the product because you guys are sending the product? What's resonating with your
Yeah,
clients?
I mean, I would argue, I guess, a couple of different things. One, it helps to go to an expert, right? I mean, I think you nailed it. Like, there's now over 4 million podcasts that exist. I mean, there's only, let's say, like 5 to 10,000 that are like actually big enough to advertise on that have some element of scale to them. So even just from the 5 to 10,000, it's like, well, which ones make the most sense for my brand? That's why you come to a company like us who says, hey, here's the half a dozen that really make the most sense for you. So that's a huge part of it, I would say. But then leveraging like as many tools as possible. Like we have certain competitive intelligence tools where we can say, okay, you're a brand that's in the food subscription space. Here's what all the rest of your brands in your space are doing. And here's some shows that they're buying that, you probably can't get on. Because a lot of times podcasts like to be exclusive by categories. So meaning if they work with, one wine subscription brand, they won't also work with you. But here's a bunch of other shows that, look similar to that show that might make sense for you. So if you don't have the luxury of having those tools, it is just more about kind of looking into like Apple Podcasts and saying, okay, I really think the true crime listener is my customer. Like that just feel that sort of female 30s to 50s type of, person feels like my customer. So just kind of go through the, Apple Podcast charts and look up, and it's surprisingly easy to sort of track down the contacts of some shows and figure out if they're a good show for you. So, that's how I'd answer that.
So all this talk about wine, this I do love wine, but reminds me of the Dilbert cartoon. I don't know if you ever saw it, but I think it was Dilbert came in looking for a new job, so he went into HR and said, "I'm looking for a new job," and they said, "Oh, what do you think you want to do?" And so I think it was engineering. Well, then you have to like triple the folds of your brain or something like that, and they go through it and they get to marketing, and he goes, "Oh yeah, that's fine. That's just liquor and guessing." So
Not
that one
terribly
made me
far off.
laugh.
Yeah.
Okay. So now we're talking about wine. We're talking about finding the right podcast. I'm like, there's a little bit of that. That's why this is imperfect marketing, right? So that's always good. So what kind of brands do you work with? If a company that's listening or watching is interested in getting started with podcast advertising, you're working with physical goods to an extent. Are you working with service-based businesses too? Or like who's the ideal customer for your company or for podcast advertising in your
Yeah, I
opinion?
mean, I would say we have a little tagline on our website that says like we're not search, we're not social, we're not TV, we're everything else. So like once brands have sort of used up what we call like the typical model marketing channels, excuse me. So like you're kind of starting to see some diminishing returns in Meta, or search is getting more competitive, or all the things that are sort of happening generally in marketing. That's when you're sort of like, all right, we got to start some new channel. That's typically where like it's ideal to kind of hit test podcasts and see if you can scale that channel the way you have other channels. But from a type of business standpoint, we're usually, I don't know if I want to give like an exact revenue range, but somebody who's,
No, you don't have to.
who's kind of built you have a solid foundation of a business at that point. I will say, you mentioned before service businesses, those can work. Like we work with a business that's like connects you with dietitians. We work with blinds companies, so like that are more service-based businesses. So those can certainly work in podcasts as well. I will say the thing that does tend to work best, no matter whether you're an e-commerce or a more service-based business, is something that's more of a considered purchase. So like, if you're a $15 wallet, like podcast might not be the best channel for you. If you have at least like $100 average order value, but that's usually what tends to work best. So something that's a little bit more of a considered purchase, because usually podcasts are people who are, a little more affluent, a little more educated than like the average person. And they're usually going to somewhere to learn, right? So you're kind of catching them at like an interesting mental moment when you can reach them. So the ideal brand would be somebody a little bit more of a considered purchase. And somebody that, again, could be e-com, could be lead generation, but just make sure it's not that, $10, $15 item.
Is the considered purchase because is podcast advertising more expensive on average
No,
than
not
some of those other channels
necessarily.
you
I
were talking
mean,
about?
no, sorry to interrupt. I was going to say the CPM kind of varies. It could be as low as like a $10 CPM and as high as like a $30 CPM, depending on the show. So, I don't work day to day in like meta advertising and things like that, but brands have told us that that's pretty standard these days in those channels. So it's not necessarily more expensive, but you get a really, significant amount of space to advertise about your brand. So technically speaking, you get like a 60-second ad in that more like host read style of advertising. But, most hosts these days go over 60 seconds. So it could, we had a 9-minute ad read the other day from a host. So sometimes they'll go on and on about a brand. But yeah, I mean, most of them are averaging like between 90 seconds and 2.5 minutes. So, if you're a brand that needs a little bit more selling space to communicate your value proposition, podcasts are really good at that versus, social or other channels where you're kind of limited from an ad space standpoint.
Yes, we hosts, we love to talk. And if you win us over with stuff, it's we're gonna share about it,
Everybody
right?
loves free stuff. Yeah.
Because that's part of what we do to add value to our audience, hopefully on a regular basis. So very cool, very interesting. So if someone wanted to get started with podcast advertising, how do you recommend that they get started? I mean, some people are going to want to call you guys, and we'll have your contact information in the show notes and description for people that want to work with you, because you do have those advanced tools, right? You do have that competitive intelligence. So if you're looking for the more sophisticated buys, definitely reach out. If they're scared about budget, right? Do they still reach out? Do you recommend that they start on their own and then reach out once they're like really successful?
Yeah, I mean, I would say we're, more flexible than most companies in the space from a budget standpoint. So yeah, I'm always happy to have a conversation and see if it makes sense. But, if you just don't think it's appropriate to bring in a company like us, then we usually recommend testing like anywhere between like 8 to 10 shows. And you want to do it across at least like 2 to 3 categories because, you know, you'd be shocked how many times like a company comes to us and it's a beauty brand and they're like, I only want beauty podcasts. That's like all I want to do. And then we'll be like, yeah, but let's try like some true crime shows. Like, we know these, half a dozen shows do really well for other brands. They should do well for you too. And, hit your CPA goal, ROAS goal, whatever your metric is. And you'd be shocked how often like the category you're in isn't necessarily the best category to advertise in that podcast channel. So yeah, you want to test,
It's crowded.
oh, and that for sure as well. And even like in the beauty example, maybe those people are really not really knowledgeable on beauty, and so they know their beauty products, so they don't need to be advertised about it. So anyways, you want like 2 to 3 categories, like a couple of news shows, a couple of true crime shows, a couple of maybe pop culture shows about like Love Island or The Bachelor or whatever it is. So anyways, you want to test a few different categories because you'd be really surprised how often the category you don't think is going to work well is the one that actually performs the best. So yeah, that'd be my recommendation.
Very cool. So you got to diversify a little bit. I think this is fantastic. So if a company is looking to get started and if you want that competitive edge to really understand where you're going, you definitely want to take a look at incremental media, especially because you guys have other tools at your disposal, right? So we talked about inserts, right? But you guys also do shared mail, you do some other things too, right?
Yeah,
Email
we
newsletters,
have kind of,
maybe? Okay.
I always describe it as like two sides to our business. So there's the more traditional channels. So that's like package inserts. Shared mail is a huge part of our business. So that's like money mailer, Valpak, Clip, if you ever got any of those to your home. So it's, shared mail, right? It's sharing the cost of sending mail to a home. Typically does really well for like home services companies or people who are more in the kind of lead generation space. Debt companies actually does really well with. And then there's like, traditional direct mail that still does well. I mean, every 6 months now, the Postal Service keeps increasing their how expensive it is to reach people. So, who knows how long that channel will stay strong for. But and then, yeah, what we call the emerging channels is the other part of our business. So that podcast, that's email newsletters, that's YouTube creators. That's another sort of kind of sister channel to podcasts. So it's like a 10-minute video and 2 minutes in, the YouTube creator kind of stops and does a little ad read. So rapidly growing space in our little podcast world. So yeah, we've got a bunch of different channels, and that's a big benefit of us as well, is like we can just look at a brand's business and say, hey, based on, the audience you're targeting, the goals you want to hit, like you're the best for podcasts, or you're the best for inserts. So we've sort of really evolved our business over the past few years to kind of help almost any kind of brand. Again, we are pretty selective in terms of, we don't do great at driving to retail, as an example. So like if somebody's trying to get, products to sell in Target, like that's probably not us. But if you're selling a product direct to consumers and it's got a little more of a considered purchase, most of the time we have a channel that makes sense for brands.
If you're thinking about podcast advertising or thinking about an effective way to reach your niche customer, you don't want to start a podcast yourself because you don't want to grow that audience. You want to work with established audiences already. Podcasts are great. I mean, the hosts have been spending years and hopefully hundreds of episodes growing their audience and growing the trust factor with that audience, that it gives you a little bit of that baked in know, like, and trust factor, right? That resonates with the audience and hopefully will end up in the purchase of your product or service. So very cool. So I think that there's a lot of things for people to think about before they get into podcast advertising. So we want to start with your strategy, what your goals are, and who your audience is. That's what everything in marketing starts with, right? But if you think that that might be something that you want to do, definitely check out Incremental Media. Again, their information is down below. But if not, and that's not a path that you want to go and you just want to like see what there is out there, again, go check out the Apple podcast charts, right? Start seeing what podcasts are trending on YouTube. Because I think YouTube actually for podcasts is overtaking, I think it was second last I had heard for podcast platforms, which is just crazy. It blows my mind. But it makes sense, right? So there's a lot of different options for you to go down. Think about who you want to reach, how you want to reach them, and then take your next steps from there. Before I let you go, Eric, though, I do need to ask you the question that I ask all of my guests. That is that this show is called Imperfect Marketing. Marketing is anything but a perfect science. What has been your biggest marketing lesson learned along the way?
I always love that question, by the way, when I listen to the podcast. So it's fun. I would say no one really truly has all the answers. So I think so often people don't want to go to subject matter experts, so they think they've got it all figured out. But like, I promise you that nobody does. Even, somebody who lives and breathes podcast, I'm constantly like, oh my God, that's a new podcast. I didn't even know that existed. So, just ask questions. There's nothing, don't be afraid to sort of wear your heart on your sleeve, because I promise you that even the subject matter experts definitely don't have all the answers. So, yeah, that's my answer.
I think that that's really good because nobody has all the answers. If I got $1 for every time somebody says, "Oh, I got screwed over by an agency, a marketing agency," I'd be rich and I would be retired and I would be living on an island somewhere. But I'm not because I don't get $1 every time someone says that. Um, because they're not asking enough questions, right? Not every solution is the right one for you. And again, you have to ask the right questions to make sure it's the right fit. I love organizations like yours that are like, hey, we're a little picky because we want to make sure you're going to deliver for you, right? That doesn't help your reputation either. And so I think that there's a lot of value there. But yes, none of us have all the answers. We like to we like to pretend we do sometimes, but marketing is definitely not a perfect science. And so therefore things are different.
Thankfully, we've been around. Or actually, our 20th anniversary is on Friday. So, 20 years of data and history, you got a lot of, knowledge on what works or what doesn't work in your channel. So, yeah, at the end of the day, we don't want to waste our time or a brand's money on something we don't think is going to work. So, I don't think everybody thinks that way of like companies in our space, but it is something we pride ourselves on, because there's only so many hours in the day and only so many brands we can work with. So we want to work with ones that, we think make the most sense. So
I love that. I love that. I know a handful of people or companies that will turn down businesses because they can't get the return that they would be looking for or would be ideal. And if they can't do that, they don't want to waste their time, the client's time or money, not getting results. And so I think that that says a lot about your company and how you guys work. So definitely check it out. Check out all of the ways to contact Incremental Media and Eric down in the show notes or YouTube description, wherever you're listening or watching. If you learned something today, and I hope that you did, it would really help me out if you would rate or subscribe wherever you're listening or watching. Until next time, have a great rest of your day.